June 10th, 1944. The sun had barely lifted above the horizon when Captain John Jack Davis pushed the throttle of his P-47 Thunderbolt to the limit. Below him, a Japanese airfield on the outskirts of Manila stretched into focus. Neat rows of fighters gleaming in the morning haze, unaware of the storm descending upon them. At 500 feet, the roar of the engine blended with the rattle of 50 caliber guns as Davis opened fire. In seconds, explosions rippled across the runway. Fuel drums bursting, aircraft igniting, men scattering for cover. The first pass alone destroyed 8 planes. By the third, the airfield was an inferno. Smoke rose in thick columns, so dense it cast shadows across the sea. What followed would be remembered as one of the most devastating strafing runs of the Pacific War. A single pilot obliterating 40 enemy aircraft in minutes. It was more than an act of courage. It was the moment that proved American air power had become unstoppable. Precision, daring, and industrial might fused into one. This is the story of pilots who made history. December 27th, 1944. The air above the Philippines shimmered with heat as a pair of twin-engined fighters cut across the sky, their polished aluminum skins catching the morning sun like mirrors. At the controls of the lead plane sat Captain Richard Ira Bong, a 24-year-old farm boy from Wisconsin who had become a living legend among pilots of the Pacific War. His aircraft, the P-38 Lightning, was unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced. Fast, heavy, deadly, and unmistakable with its twin booms and central cockpit pod. Beneath the calm rhythm of the engines lay a machine built for domination. In Bong's hands, it became an extension of instinct itself, capable of feats that seemed to defy physics and fear alike. That morning, he would claim his 40th confirmed aerial victory, securing his place as America's highest-scoring ace. But his story was not merely one of numbers. It was the story of how precision, discipline, and quiet confidence in the cockpit reshaped the Pacific Air War, and how a modest young man from Poplar, Wisconsin, came to embody the impossible momentum of Allied air power. Richard Bong's journey began far from battlefields, in the rolling dairy country of northern Wisconsin. He grew up the eldest of 9 children, raised on chores and quiet responsibility. His fascination with flight started early, when mail planes from Minneapolis passed overhead on summer mornings. He would stop his work to watch their silver shapes fade into the clouds. By the time he reached high school, aviation was no longer a dream, but a calling. In 1938, he entered Superior State Teachers College to study education, but his real classroom was the sky. Civilian pilot training programs, sponsored by the government, offered young Americans a path into aviation, and Bong, with his sharp eyes and steady hands, stood out immediately. His instructors described him as meticulous, cautious, and impossibly smooth on the controls, qualities that would later make him lethal in combat. When the Army Air Corps expanded its pilot program in 1941, Bong enlisted without hesitation. He trained in California, mastering the P-38 Lightning under instructors who quickly realized they were dealing with something rare. A pilot whose aggression was tempered by restraint, whose calm under pressure bordered on unnatural. The P-38 itself was a marvel of American engineering, a twin-engine interceptor capable of climbing to 40,000 feet, armed with 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all concentrated in its nose. Unlike most fighters that relied on wing-mounted guns requiring precise convergence, the Lightning's central battery meant its firepower stayed deadly at nearly any range. The aircraft's twin Allison engines gave it both speed and endurance, allowing it to range farther across the Pacific than any single-engine fighter. To the men who flew it, the Lightning was both guardian and predator. Its nickname among Japanese pilots, Two-Tailed Devil, carried a grudging respect. For Richard Bong, it was the perfect partner. He learned every vibration, every trend of the propellers, every subtle shift that signaled performance or danger. In a war where seconds decided survival, Bong's near-symbiotic bond with his aircraft became his greatest weapon. By mid-1942, he was assigned to the 49th Fighter Group in Australia, flying defensive patrols during the desperate months following the fall of the Philippines. His first kills came in the skies over Buna, New Guinea, where Allied forces fought to halt Japanese expansion across the Pacific. In those early encounters, Bong displayed the tactical patience that would define his career. While many pilots rushed headlong into dogfights, he studied enemy behavior, learning how Japanese Zeros turned tighter but bled energy faster, how they climbed sharply but stalled under sustained pursuit. He struck not from impulse but from calculation, entering combat only when angles, altitude, and surprise favored him. His comrades began calling him Bing Bong for his cheerful manner, unaware that behind the grin was a mathematical mind constantly measuring range, speed, and fuel consumption with subconscious precision. In December 1942, he recorded his first 2 victories near Buna, downing a pair of Mitsubishi A6M0s in rapid succession. The following months saw his reputation grow quietly as his tally climbed. He refused to boast and often deflected praise toward his crew chief or fellow pilots, but word spread through the squadron that Bong possessed something almost unnatural, a sixth sense for combat geometry. Captain Thomas Lynch, one of his commanding officers, later recalled that Bong could see 3 moves ahead, like a chess player in the sky. While others fixated on the target in front of them, Bong anticipated where the next attack would come from, positioning himself accordingly. His success had nothing to do with recklessness. He rarely fired unless certain of a hit. His gun camera footage, later analyzed by intelligence officers, showed astonishing efficiency. Bursts lasting mere seconds, each yielding visible destruction. Every engagement was deliberate, every maneuver calculated. By the spring of 1943, the Pacific Air War was shifting. The United States had seized the initiative, pushing northward from Australia through New Guinea toward the Philippines. Long-range fighter escorts became essential to support bombers attacking Japanese bases scattered across tropical jungles and volcanic islands. The P-38, with its twin engines and range exceeding 1,000 miles, became indispensable. In these operations, Bong's skill reached full expression. He flew in tight formation over endless expanses of ocean, often through towering thunderstorms that swallowed entire squadrons. Navigation was primitive, radio contact unreliable. To lose sight of one's wingman was to vanish into nothingness. Yet Bong thrived in this chaos. He often returned with extra fuel after missions that left others nearly dry, evidence of his ability to manage every detail in the cockpit while maintaining perfect composure. One of his most remarkable feats occurred on July 26, 1943, during an escort mission over Lae, New Guinea. Spotting a formation of Japanese bombers approaching from the north, Bong and his wingman climbed to intercept. As they dove through broken clouds, tracers arced upward from the bombers' defensive gunners. Bong weaved through the fire, his guns blazing in short, surgical bursts. Within minutes, 2 Betty bombers were spiraling down in flames. Then, noticing enemy fighters diving from above, he rolled sharply and looped behind them, downing 2 Zeros before they realized he had reversed position. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. 4 confirmed kills. Not a single round wasted. When he landed, ground crews counted fewer than 250 cartridge cases ejected from his guns, less than half the ammunition most pilots expended in one encounter. That economy of action became his signature. The US command recognized Bong's unique balance of aggression and discipline and increasingly used him as an instructor between combat tours. He resisted, preferring the front lines, but accepted the role out of duty. He trained younger pilots to survive, emphasizing fundamentals. Always keep altitude advantage. Never chase a diving Zero beyond your fuel range. And trust your wingman's eyes as much as your own. His students later credited him with saving countless lives. Yet Bong remained restless on the ground. He returned to combat in 1944 as part of the 49th and later the 5th Air Force, flying from newly captured fields across the Pacific. Each mission brought new challenges, longer distances, harsher weather, and increasingly desperate Japanese defenses. By March 1944, his kill count had reached 27, surpassing Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26. The feat made headlines across the United States. Newspapers dubbed him America's Ace of Aces, but Bong deflected attention with humility that bordered on discomfort. When a reporter asked how it felt to be the top-scoring fighter pilot, he replied simply, "I just try to get home every time." For the Army Air Forces, Bong's image became a symbol of quiet confidence, proof that America's strength lay not in arrogance, but in mastery. While propaganda posters celebrated his victories, Bong continued flying, adding to his total with methodical consistency. Each kill was recorded only after confirmation by other pilots or gun camera footage. He refused credit for uncertain engagements. His integrity reinforced his legend. The P-38 itself evolved alongside him. Improvements in turbochargers, fuel capacity, and armament turned it into a multi-role weapon, capable of both high-altitude interception and low-level strafing. Bong excelled in both realms. He developed tactics that exploited the Lightning's unique strengths: boom and zoom attacks from altitude, rapid climbs using twin-engine power, and coordinated maneuvers with wingmen to trap agile but fragile enemy fighters. Japanese pilots, once dominant, began to avoid confrontation when P-38s appeared. Allied intelligence intercepted radio messages referring to Bong by name. His presence in the sky was enough to alter enemy flight plans. To the men on the ground, he was the embodiment of American air supremacy. Despite his success, Bong remained grounded in the everyday routines of war. He wrote letters home filled with mundane details: weather, food, mechanical quirks of his plane. He sent gifts to his fiancée, Marjorie Vattendahl, a student he had met before deployment. In photographs, he appears boyish, smiling faintly beneath his flight helmet, unaware that history would soon immortalize him. His fellow pilots described him as soft-spoken, occasionally shy, yet unwavering once airborne. The contrast between the gentle Midwestern farmhand and the precise aerial predator fascinated journalists. But those who served with him understood. Bong's demeanor was not contradiction, but coherence. His calmness was the very thing that allowed him to function amid chaos. His 40th and final confirmed victory came on December the 17th, 1944, during operations over Luzon in the Philippines. The mission began like many before, escort for bombers striking enemy supply lines. Japanese fighters rose to intercept, and Bong, flying his familiar P-38 downbeat, spotted two Oscars climbing toward the formation. He dived from 20,000 feet, fired a brief burst, and watched one enemy explode. Pulling up sharply, he rolled to engage the second, closing distance with surgical precision. 2 seconds of fire, another flash, another kill. Moments later, radio chatter confirmed what no one had yet realized. Bong had reached 40. The number itself carried symbolic weight. 40 confirmed air-to-air kills, the pinnacle of American aerial combat. Yet his reaction remained characteristically subdued. When congratulated on the ground, he merely nodded and said, "I guess that's enough." Headquarters agreed. He was ordered home for good. Bong's return to the United States made him a national hero. He received the Medal of Honor from General Douglas MacArthur in January 1945, the citation praising his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. Yet he remained uncomfortable with fame. While other aces toured to sell war bonds, Bong preferred to visit training bases, sharing lessons with new pilots preparing for the final push toward Japan. He emphasized discipline over daring, observation over instinct. "The first man to see is usually the first man to live," he told them. His humility made him beloved among servicemen and civilians alike. Photographs from the period show crowds of school children gathered around him, clutching model planes for signatures. To them, he was proof that ordinary Americans could achieve extraordinary things through skill and patience. Tragically, Richard Bong's story ended before the war itself. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, he was killed while testing a new jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star in California. A fuel pump malfunction caused the engine to fail during takeoff. He ejected too low for his parachute to open. News of his death spread within hours, overshadowed by the day's world-shattering events, but deeply felt across the nation. For those who had followed his career, the timing carried haunting symbolism. America's greatest piston engine ace lost on the day the jet age began. The lightning he had mastered was already giving way to a new era, but Bong's legacy endured as a bridge between generations, the last of the great dogfighters, the first to demonstrate how industrial precision and human discipline could merge into one. Historians often describe Bong's record purely in numbers: 40 kills, more than 500 combat hours, no lost wingman under his leadership. Yet the deeper story lies in what those numbers represented. Each victory was not merely a duel, but a data point in the evolution of American air strategy. Bong's methods influenced training doctrines emphasizing situational awareness, fuel management, and teamwork. His efficiency inspired engineers to refine targeting systems and gunnery sights. His composure became case study material for aviation psychologists, seeking to understand how stress and cognition interacted in high-speed combat. Decades later, flight manuals still referenced his techniques under the banner of energy management, the art of converting altitude, speed, and position into advantage. Bong had practiced it intuitively long before theory caught up. In the broader context of the Pacific War, Bong's achievements symbolized the convergence of industrial capacity and individual excellence. The P-38 itself was a product of America's vast manufacturing network, thousands of workers, engineers, and logistics systems delivering parts from across the continent. Every victory Bong achieved was therefore a collective one, born of factories in California, aluminum from Tennessee, and fuel refined in Texas. His success in the air mirrored the same industrial miracle that built the ships, tanks, and aircraft sustaining the Allied advance. In this sense, Bong's Lightning was not just a fighter plane, but a flying emblem of national coordination. Each bullet, each gallon of fuel, each replacement engine a testament to an economy mobilized for freedom. After the war, those who had served with him often reflected on the paradox of his fame. He despised killing, yet became history's exemplar of it. He sought anonymity, yet could not escape renown. Colonel Charles MacDonald, himself an ace with 36 kills, wrote that Bong fought without hatred, without thrill, only with a sense of duty. That quiet professionalism shaped the ethos of post-war American aviation, an understanding that mastery, not fury, defined victory. In memorials across Wisconsin, Bong's name appears not in bronze alone, but in stories told by veterans who recalled how he treated mechanics, clerks, and cooks with equal respect. To them, his calm humanity mattered as much as his combat record. Today, the image of Richard Ira Bong endures as a reflection of a moment when courage and technology reached equilibrium. His P-38 Lightning, preserved in museums and airshows, still evokes awe with its twin tails and gleaming fuselage. Visitors run their hands along its metal skin, imagining the young man who once sat behind those controls, thousands of miles from home, calculating angles and survival with unflinching focus. His victories remind us that even amid total war, precision and discipline could prevail over chaos. The impossible strafing runs, the single bursts that ended battles in seconds, the calm radio voice reporting another one down, all were expressions of a larger truth, that mastery, when paired with purpose, can turn the tide of history. Richard Bong did not seek immortality, but he found it among the clouds he once chased as a boy. His 40 victories were not just the tally of destroyed aircraft. They were milestones in humanity's relentless pursuit of excellence under pressure. From the farmlands of Wisconsin to the skies over the Pacific, his story captures the quiet strength that defined America's airmen. Skill over fury, patience over impulse, precision over chaos. In the end, Bong's legacy is not merely that of a killer ace, but of a craftsman of flight, one who transformed a machine of war into a tool of balance, discipline, and impossible grace. June 19th, 1944. The skies over the Philippine Sea were a deep, endless blue, broken only by thin streaks of white vapor trailing high above the ocean. Beneath those contrails sailed the most powerful naval force ever assembled. 15 American aircraft carriers moved in perfect formation, their decks alive with motion. Mechanics tightening bolts, gunners checking ammunition, deck crews signaling with bright flags against the sunlight. From horizon to horizon, the sea shimmered with the gray silhouettes of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Together, they formed Task Force 58, the beating heart of American naval aviation. In the next 48 hours, they would deliver a blow so devastating that Japanese pilots would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was not arrogance that gave the battle its name. It was simple arithmetic. On that day, skill, radar, and industrial precision converged to turn the sky itself into a demonstration of American supremacy. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was born out of desperation. Japan's empire was shrinking, its once dominant navy bleeding strength with every engagement. The American capture of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, threatened to bring the war to Japan's doorstep. From those islands, long-range B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo itself. The Imperial Japanese Navy could not allow that. They gathered what remained of their carrier force, 9 carriers carrying over 400 aircraft, and sent them eastward under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. It was their last chance to reverse the tide, a gamble to crush the American invasion fleet before the Marianas fell. But Ozawa's force was a shadow of its former glory. Many of his pilots were barely trained. Young men rushed into cockpits after only 60 or 70 flight hours compared to the hundreds logged by their American counterparts. Their Zero fighters, once the terror of the Pacific, now faced advanced Hellcats equipped with radar guidance and heavier firepower. The stage was set for a massacre. Aboard the American carrier USS Lexington, Lieutenant Alex Vratu sat in the cockpit of his F-6F Hellcat, its Pratt & Whitney engine idling at a low growl. 25 years old, lean, confident, and focused, he was one of the Navy's rising stars, a protege of Edward Butch O'Hare, the Navy's first Ace and Medal of Honor recipient. Vratu had learned under O'Hare's personal guidance that victory in the air came not from daring, but from discipline. "Wait for the right shot," O'Hare had told him. "Don't spray. Don't chase. Make every bullet count." Those words had shaped Vratu's style. He flew not like a hunter driven by adrenaline, but like a craftsman executing a plan. His plane bore 11 small rising sun flags beneath the cockpit, each representing a confirmed kill. But he carried himself with the calm detachment of a man who viewed his job as a science, not a thrill. That morning, radar operators aboard the USS Lexington picked up multiple contacts, Japanese aircraft approaching from the west at high altitude. The distance was nearly 150 miles, but radar technology, now fully matured after years of refinement, gave the Americans something Japan lacked: time. Controllers in the ship's Combat Information Center plotted intercept courses, calculating speed, altitude, and bearing. When the call came, "Enemy raid inbound, Vector 270, Angels 20. Vratu's squadron was already in the air. The Hellcats climbed smoothly, their wings glinting as they ascended through the haze. To the men below, the sight was both thrilling and comforting. Machines born from American industry, flown by men honed through endless training, rising to meet the challenge that would decide the future of the Pacific. The first contact came at 10:04 a.m. The Japanese had launched nearly 300 aircraft in 4 separate waves, Zeros, Vals, and Judys, hoping to strike the American carriers from long range. But their strategy was fatally outdated. As the attackers approached, they found themselves intercepted not over their targets, but nearly 50 miles out to sea. Hellcats diving from above tore through their formations before they even sighted the fleet. The air became a storm of tracers and falling debris. Within minutes, dozens of Japanese planes were in flames, plunging toward the ocean. American pilots later described the scene as almost unreal. Enemy bombers flying straight and level, gunners firing wildly into empty sky. No evasive tactics, no coordination. Years of attrition had robbed Japan of its veterans. Now green recruits faced men who had survived Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and the Marshalls. The result was slaughter. Vratu spotted his first targets around mid-morning, 6 Yokosuka D-4Y. Judy dive bombers descending toward the fleet in loose formation. He banked his Hellcat into the sun, approaching unseen from above and behind. When the range closed to 200 yards, he squeezed the trigger once, the 6.50 caliber guns roaring in unison. The first Judy exploded instantly, breaking apart in a burst of flame. Without hesitation, he rolled right, lined up the second, and fired another short burst. It disintegrated. The third tried to dive for cover, but Vraciu followed us, throttling back just enough to hold position. 2 seconds of fire, another kill. In less than 2 minutes, 3 enemy bombers were gone. His radio crackled with voices. "Nice shooting, Alex!" But he ignored the chatter, already turning for the next group. He dove again, his airspeed climbing past 400 knots. The fourth Judy filled his gun sight, then vanished in a fireball. A fifth appeared ahead, wobbling under anti-aircraft fire. Another burst, another kill. By the time the sixth plane fell burning into the sea, only 8 minutes had passed since his first shot. 6 confirmed kills in a single sortie, the kind of performance that would have seemed impossible only a year earlier. When he landed back on the Lexington deck, crews cheered. His ammunition counters showed fewer than 500 rounds expended, proof of his deadly precision. Reporters later compared his feat to the duels of World War I aces, but in truth, Vraciu's success represented something far more modern. This was not romance or luck. It was the culmination of technology, training, and doctrine, what the Navy called the kill chain. From radar detection to ground control intercept, from formation discipline to weapons reliability, every element functioned with machine-like coordination. America's factories had produced aircraft that could outclimb, outdive, and outgun the enemy. Its schools had produced pilots who knew how to use them. The battle that day demonstrated what total industrial war looked like when every system worked as intended. By afternoon, the scale of destruction became clear. The Japanese had lost more than 200 aircraft in a single day, many without ever firing a shot at the American fleet. Those who survived described the horror of flying into walls of tracer fire, of seeing comrades vanish in flashes of flame, of hearing American pilots coolly calling out kill confirmations over open radio. For the Japanese Navy, it was the end of an era. The carriers that had once struck Pearl Harbor now floated powerless, their decks empty, their hangars silent. Fuel shortages, poor training, and obsolete tactics had turned them into floating coffins. The Americans, by contrast, lost only about 30 aircraft, many to accidents or mechanical issues rather than enemy fire. The numerical imbalance was so extreme that one naval officer remarked, "It wasn't a battle, it was an execution." Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace with 34 kills, later reflected that the Marianas air battle was the turning point of naval aviation. "The Japanese never recovered after that," he said. "Their air arm was finished." Yet amid the statistics and triumph, the human side of the story remained equally striking. Pilots like Alex Vraciu had spent years honing their craft, surviving exhaustion, disease, and endless training cycles. The ease of victory that day belied the brutal learning curve that had preceded it. The Hellcat itself was born out of hard lessons learned in the early years of the war, lessons paid for with blood over Wake Island and Coral Sea. Now, all that experience coalesced into effortless efficiency. When Vraciu's guns fell silent, he had achieved what few pilots ever would: 6 kills in 8 minutes, without being hit once. His performance earned him the Navy Cross and cemented his place among the greatest naval aviators of the war. But the battle was not over. On June 20th, the following day, Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered a massive counterstrike against the retreating Japanese fleet. Nearly 240 American aircraft took off at dusk, pushing the limits of range and endurance to reach the enemy before nightfall. The attack sank 3 carriers and crippled others, completing the destruction begun the day before. The return flight became one of the most perilous episodes in naval history, as pilots tried to find their carriers in darkness, with fuel nearly gone. Mitchell, defying procedure, ordered every ship to turn on its lights, a glowing path across the ocean that guided hundreds of pilots home. That act of defiance saved countless lives and symbolized the human side of technological war. Behind the machinery and strategy, compassion still guided command. In hindsight, historians see the Great Marianas turkey shoot as more than a battle. It was a demonstration of how the United States had mastered the modern art of war. Radar coordination, disciplined communication, mass production, and standardized training had transformed warfare from chaos into system. The Japanese entered the fight with courage, but without infrastructure. The Americans entered with machines and doctrine that multiplied human capability. The results were inevitable. One Japanese officer later wrote in his diary, "We met the enemy in the sky, but we were not fighting men. We were fighting a system." It could not be defeated. That observation captures the essence of June 1944. America's strength lay not merely in bravery, but in organization. Every aircraft launched, every round fired. Every rescue mission was part of a seamless machine powered by a nation united for one purpose. For the pilots who flew that day, the victory was exhilarating but sobering. Many had seen friends lost in earlier campaigns and understood how thin the line between triumph and tragedy could be. Frachu himself would later say, "I didn't feel joy after those 6 kills. I felt relief. Relief that I'd done my job and that I was still alive." His humility mirrored that of Richard Bong, the Army Air Force's ace who fought over the same ocean in a different machine. Both men represented a new breed of warrior, technicians of the sky, whose mastery came not from aggression, but from understanding. In their calm precision lay the secret to American victory: control over fear, over instinct, over chaos itself. By the end of June 1944, the Japanese carrier air arm had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Of the roughly 400 aircraft that had taken off during the battle, more than 350 were destroyed. American losses totaled 49. The imbalance was staggering, but the implications even greater. With Japan's last trained pilots gone, the skies of the Pacific belonged entirely to the Allies. From that point onward, Japan would rely increasingly on desperate measures: kamikaze attacks, last-ditch defenses, and symbolic gestures of defiance. The Great Marianas turkey shoot marked the moment when technological and logistical superiority turned the tide irreversibly. In the months that followed, Alex Vraciu continued flying combat missions, adding to his tally until it reached 19 confirmed victories. Yet his fame never changed his demeanor. After the war, he served as a test pilot and later as a naval officer, retiring quietly without seeking the spotlight. In interviews, he spoke not of glory, but of professionalism. "War isn't about numbers or medals," he said. "It's about doing your duty, the best you can, and coming home." His words echoed those of countless aviators who had survived the Pacific, men who had witnessed not just combat, but the transformation of warfare itself. Looking back, the Great Marianas turkey shoot remains one of history's most lopsided battles. Yet it carries lessons far deeper than its statistics. It showed that victory favors not merely courage, but preparation, not passion, but precision. Every Hellcat that flew that day was the result of millions of hours of labor in factories across America, women riveting fuselages in California, men forging engines in Connecticut, students collecting scrap metal in Iowa. Each pilot's triumph in the sky was the visible tip of an invisible pyramid of effort and coordination. When Alex Vraciu downed 6 bombers in 8 minutes, he was not just fighting as an individual. He was the living embodiment of a nation's collective discipline. The Japanese pilots who perished that day flew bravely. But bravery alone could not match a system that combined radar, production, and training into an unbreakable chain. The sky over the Philippine Sea became a classroom where the lessons of industrial warfare were written in contrails and smoke. The Americans had learned them first and mastered them absolutely. For the men who watched the sun set over the Marianas that June, the ocean below seemed almost calm again, littered with burning wreckage, slowly sinking into silence. They had witnessed the end of one empire's dream and the solidification of another's dominance. And as the carriers turned eastward toward Guam, their decks still warm from the day's heat, the sound of aircraft engines faded into the wind, leaving only the quiet realization that the Pacific War had changed forever. Winter, 1944. Across the mist-covered fields of northern France, the sound of engines shattered the morning stillness. 8 Republic P-47. Thunderbolts swept low over the horizon, sunlight glinting off their armored fuselages as they descended toward a line of German airfields hidden among hedgerows and farm roads. The pilots flew barely 50 feet above the ground, so low that their propellers sliced through the morning fog like blades through cloth. At the head of the formation, Lieutenant Colonel Gilbert O. Gib Christensen adjusted his gun sight, his gloved hand steady despite the turbulence. Below him stretched a German fighter base crowded with parked Focke-Wulfs, fuel trucks, and maintenance sheds. In seconds, the Thunderbolts would unleash a storm of lead and fire that would leave the field unrecognizable. It was a scene repeated across occupied Europe in those final months of the war, when American pilots of the 9th Air Force turned low-level attack into an art form, and no squadron embodied that mastery more completely than the Hell Hawks. The Republic's 47 Thunderbolt was unlike any other fighter of its era. Heavy, rugged, and brutally fast in a dive, it was built not as a nimble duelist, but as a flying tank. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine generated more than 2,000 horsepower, driving the plane to speeds over 430 miles per hour. Beneath its broad wings sat 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 on each side, capable of firing nearly 100 rounds per second. Fully loaded, the Thunderbolt could carry bombs, rockets, and drop tanks, transforming it from fighter to attack aircraft at will. German pilots nicknamed it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, a name that captured both its shape and its reputation for indestructibility. Where other fighters limped home riddled with holes, the P-47 often returned with entire sections of armor scorched or missing, and still flying steady. It was a machine designed for punishment, and in the hands of the right pilot, it became a weapon of relentless precision. The men who flew them came from every corner of America: farmers, mechanics, students, and adventurers who found themselves thrust into one of history's most mechanized wars. Among them was Captain Bertie Marshall of the 365 Fighter Group, the unit soon to be known as the Hell Hawks. Stationed in England in early 1944, they spent months training for the invasion of Europe. Their mission was simple but perilous: to dive low over enemy territory and destroy anything that moved. Roads, railways, convoys, bridges, airfields. Nothing was safe beneath their wings. The tactics they developed blurred the line between fighter and bomber, blending the agility of air combat with the ruthless efficiency of ground attack. They flew not to duel, but to devastate. The Thunderbolts' engine roared like a freight train when pushed to full throttle, and its pilots learned to use that power to their advantage. A typical airfield raid began with a silent approach over friendly lines at 15,000 feet. Once the target came into view, often located by reconnaissance photographs or radio intercepts, the formation descended in a long, shallow dive. The objective was surprise. Speed and altitude would be traded for shock and precision. At 1,000 feet, the Thunderbolts split into pairs, each assigned a sector of the field. Then the world turned into chaos. 8 machine guns per plane spat out streams of tracers, tearing through hangars, parked aircraft, and fuel drums. Explosions rippled across the runway. Pilots described the experience as both terrifying and exhilarating, the sensation of racing through walls of smoke and debris while the ground blurred beneath them at over 400 miles per hour. One of the most daring raids came in late March 1944, when the Hell Hawks attacked the airfield at Dreux, France. Intelligence had reported a concentration of German FW-19 preparing for transfer to Normandy. At dawn, 2 squadrons of Thunderbolts crossed the channel under a low ceiling of clouds, their propellers icing through drizzle and sleet. As they reached the French coast, enemy radar failed to detect them. The flight leader, Major Dave Schilling, spotted the airfield by a break in the mist, a rectangle of pale concrete dotted with aircraft. He signaled with his wings, and the squadron dived as one. The first P-47s roared down the runway at treetop level, their guns blazing. The initial burst struck a line of fuel trucks, detonating them in a chain of fireballs. Secondary explosions erupted as parked fighters ignited, their ammunition cooking off like popcorn. Anti-aircraft gunners scrambled to respond, but their tracers streaked harmlessly behind the retreating planes. Schilling pulled up at the far end of the field, banked hard, and came around for another pass. Within minutes, the airfield was a burning ruin. 23 enemy planes destroyed on the ground. No American losses. It was surgical devastation, shock warfare executed with industrial precision. The success of the Hell Hawks and other Thunderbolt groups stemmed from relentless practice. Pilots studied maps, learned to identify targets from mere glimpses, and trained to fly lower than seemed sane. They memorized the patterns of flak batteries and developed timing so exact that entire formations could weave between bursts of anti-aircraft fire without breaking cohesion. The Thunderbolt's weight made it stable even at extreme speeds, allowing pilots to aim with remarkable accuracy. Its turbo-supercharged engine maintained power at low altitude, and its thick armor protected the cockpit from small arms fire. Many pilots returned with dozens of holes in their wings or tail, their canopies cracked, control cables severed, and yet they landed safely. "You could almost plow one into the ground and it'd bounce back up," one pilot joked. The raids were not without cost. The low altitude that gave the P-47 its accuracy also exposed it to small caliber fire from every farmhouse, truck, and tree line. Pilots learned to recognize the telltale flashes of rifles and machine guns and to return fire instantly. The cockpit canopy, though armored, often filled with the metallic sound of impacts as bullets ricocheted off the frame. Lieutenant Red Jameson of the 366 Fighter Squadron described one mission where his Thunderbolt was hit 87 times by ground fire. He limped home on one engine, his instruments shattered, his landing gear refusing to extend. He belly landed in a muddy field and crawled out unhurt. "The jug saved me," he said simply. Stories like his became legend within the 9th Air Force. The Thunderbolt might not have been elegant, but it brought its pilots home. By the summer of 1944, as Allied forces pushed deeper into France, the Hellhawks began operating from newly captured airstrips only miles behind the front lines. Their mission evolved from pre-invasion strikes to direct tactical support. When armored columns advanced, Thunderbolts cleared the roads ahead. When German counterattacks formed, they shredded them with bombs and rockets. But it was on the airfields that their work remained most dramatic. Intelligence officers tracked the retreat of the Luftwaffe, pinpointing forward bases crammed with aircraft too damaged or short on fuel to escape. These became priority targets. In August, near Chartres, the Hellhawks attacked a field containing nearly 50 German planes, mostly Ju-88s and Me-109s lined wingtip to wingtip. The P-47s swooped in from the sun, guns flashing. One pilot recalled seeing a mechanic running from a hangar just before the roof collapsed in fire. Another watched a pair of Me-10-9s attempt to take off amid the chaos. Both were destroyed before leaving the ground. The raid lasted less than 10 minutes. 47 aircraft confirmed destroyed or damaged beyond repair. American losses: 1 Thunderbolt forced down, the pilot rescued by French villagers hours later. Such raids had a psychological effect far beyond the immediate destruction. Luftwaffe mechanics began dispersing aircraft across fields, hiding them under camouflage nets or forest canopies. Fuel convoys traveled only at night. Even so, the Thunderbolts found them. Their combination of speed, endurance, and firepower made them the most feared presence in the European sky. German pilots later admitted that they dreaded the distinctive howl of the P-47's engine during dive attacks, a deep, rising roar that signaled death from above. The sound became so recognizable that Allied ground troops used it as reassurance. "If you heard that scream," one infantryman recalled, "you knew the jugs were working for you, not against you." One of the most celebrated individual missions occurred on October 6th, 1944, when Captain Ray Mitchell led a flight of 4 Thunderbolts against a heavily defended airfield near Bonn, Germany. The field served as a refueling and maintenance hub for the Luftwaffe's jet fighters, the new Me-262s that threatened to challenge Allied air superiority. The risk was enormous. Radar-guided flak and heavy guns surrounded the area. But Mitchell volunteered. Approaching at low altitude through morning haze, he and his men burst from the clouds less than 2 miles from the target. The Germans had no time to react. Mitchell's first burst destroyed 2 jets parked nose to nose under a hangar canopy. His wingman set fire to a row of fuel trucks, while the remaining pair strafed the control tower. Flak erupted, tearing holes through the formation. 1 Thunderbolt went down, crashing near the perimeter fence. The others pressed on, circling back for a second attack, despite smoke and debris obscuring the runway. By the time they withdrew, 7 enemy aircraft burned, the hangar complex reduced to rubble. Mitchell's plane returned trailing fuel, one wing nearly severed. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, but when asked about the mission, he shrugged. "We were just doing what the Jug was built to do." The P-47's dominance in the ground attack role reshaped Allied strategy. Air superiority was no longer the end goal. It was the foundation for total battlefield control. The 9th Air Force used Thunderbolts to isolate German forces, severing supply lines and destroying reinforcements before they reached the front. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, Thunderbolts struck columns of armor moving through the snow-covered forests. Pilots reported the eerie beauty of their tracer rounds, glowing orange against white ground, the explosions echoing through valleys. Each sortie chipped away at German mobility, grinding their counteroffensive to a halt. By war's end, P-47 units claimed destruction of over 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 tanks, and more than 68,000 trucks and armored vehicles. But the airfield raids remained the most symbolic, proof that even on the ground, the Luftwaffe was no longer safe. The power of those missions came not only from destruction, but from demonstration. The Germans, once masters of precision warfare, now faced an enemy who matched their efficiency and surpassed their scale. Every burned aircraft, every cratered runway testified to the transformation of the American war machine. Factories in Connecticut, Ohio, and California produced Thunderbolts faster than the Luftwaffe could replace losses. Pilots received standardized training that allowed seamless coordination between units. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowed continuously across the Atlantic through a logistical network of staggering complexity. Each low-level attack was therefore more than an act of combat. It was an industrial performance, a living symbol of modern warfare's mechanics. The Thunderbolt was not just a plane. It was the visible expression of a system that could build, repair, and replace faster than the enemy could react. By April 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self. Most German airfields lay in ruins, their runways littered with twisted wreckage and bomb craters. When the Hellhawks flew their final missions, they found no targets left to destroy. Pilots circled empty airstrips, sometimes dropping messages instead of bombs to signal surrender. The war that had begun with the shock of Stuka dive bombers now ended with the silence of abandoned hangars. The P-47s returned to their bases, streaked with oil and dust, their fuselages marked by months of relentless service. Mechanics patched bullet holes with sheet metal, cleaned guns, and refueled planes that might never fly another mission. Victory had arrived quietly, almost anticlimactically, carried on the wings of machines built for endurance rather than glory. In retrospect, the airfield raids by Thunderbolt pilots represented the final evolution of tactical air power in World War II. What began as improvised attacks in 1943 became a doctrine of precision assault, a fusion of technology and human adaptability. The pilots who flew those missions understood that war had become a contest not of bravery alone, but of systems. Each raid was a message. No enemy could hide behind infrastructure. No airfield could operate unchallenged. No empire could sustain itself without command of the sky. The Hellhawks and their fellow P-47 squadrons ensured that command belonged to the Allies. Their missions stripped away the Luftwaffe's last illusions of control, clearing the path for the final invasion of Germany. When peace came, many Thunderbolt pilots returned home to quiet lives. They rarely spoke of the raids. Perhaps because the memory carried the weight of what they had witnessed. Smoke rising from airfields, the flash of explosions reflecting off their canopies, the faces of mechanics and soldiers glimpsed for an instant before disappearing in fire. Yet within those moments lay the essence of modern warfare: speed, precision, and inevitability. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the flying fortress of the tactical air war, had proven that victory no longer depended solely on who fought hardest, but on who built fastest, planned smarter, and flew lower without fear. The Hell Hawks left behind a legacy written not in parades or medals, but in the silent ruins of airfields scattered across Europe. Their work paved the way for every generation of close air support pilots who followed from Korea to Iraq. Each time a jet dives low to strike an enemy position, it carries within it the DNA of those Thunderbolts and the men who dared to fly them inches above the ground. The impossible strafing runs of 1944, those precision attacks that seemed suicidal yet succeeded again and again, remain among the most extraordinary feats in aviation history. They proved that mastery of flight was not only measured by altitude or speed, but by the courage to fly into the teeth of danger with steady hands and unwavering focus. The Jug had done its job. It had turned the skies of Europe into the anvil upon which victory was forged. October 17th, 1943. The Solomon Islands lay quiet beneath a blanket of tropical haze, the calm surface of the sea broken only by the scattered silhouettes of coral reefs. From the air, the islands looked peaceful, emerald shapes adrift in a turquoise ocean. But the skies above them were the most dangerous airspace in the Pacific. It was here that Major Gregory Pappy Boyington and his Marine Fighter Squadron 214, the Black Sheep, carved their legend. On that morning, as Boyington taxied his Vought F-4U Corsair across the coral runway of Vela La Vela, the humidity clung to his flight suit like another layer of skin. He checked his gauges, adjusted his oxygen mask, and glanced toward the line of fighters waiting behind him, men who had flown with him for only weeks, but trusted him completely. The mission was simple: patrol north toward Kahili and strike any Japanese aircraft daring to challenge them. What followed would become one of the defining stories of the South Pacific Air War, a contest of will, skill, and raw instinct between American precision and Japanese persistence. Gregory Boyington was an unlikely hero. Born in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in 1912, he grew up restless, competitive, and defiant of authority. Before the war, he had served briefly in the Marine Corps, then resigned to join the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, in China. There he learned the fundamentals of air combat against Japanese pilots years before Pearl Harbor. Those early experiences hardened him, but they also revealed his contradictions. He was brilliant yet reckless, disciplined in the cockpit, but chaotic on the ground. His fellow pilots nicknamed him Pappy, not just because he was older, 31 when he took command, but because he carried himself like a grizzled veteran in a squadron of boys. Under his leadership, the Black Sheep Squadron became something rare, a unit built not on regulation, but on trust. The Corsair they flew was as unruly as its pilots. Powered by an 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney engine producing over 2,000 horsepower, it was one of the fastest fighters in the world, capable of climbing at 4,000 feet per minute and reaching 446 miles per hour. Its distinctive gull wings gave it a sinister beauty, but they also made it difficult to land. Many pilots called it the Ensign Eliminator, for the number of inexperienced flyers who crashed during training. Boyington loved it instantly. To him, the Corsair was not dangerous. It was honest. It demanded skill, rewarded precision, and punished arrogance. In combat, it could outdove and outgun almost anything the Japanese could field. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns could shred an aircraft in seconds. Boyington saw it as the perfect weapon for his kind of war, fast, brutal, and personal. By the time the Black Sheep Squadron arrived in the Solomons in September 1943, the tide of the Pacific War was turning. The long grind of Guadalcanal had ended in American victory, but Japanese air power still dominated much of the region. From bases on Bougainville, Rabaul, and Kahili, enemy bombers continued to harass Allied positions daily. The job of the Black Sheep was to break that power, to sweep the skies clean. They flew out of hastily built airstrips carved from jungle and coral, their operations timed by weather, fuel, and luck. Missions often lasted less than an hour, but every minute carried the weight of survival. Boyington's approach to combat was direct. He believed that hesitation killed more pilots than enemy bullets. His tactic was simple: dive fast, fire first, and never let the enemy dictate the terms of the fight. He drilled his men relentlessly, teaching them to fly the Corsair to its limits, to trust the engine's power, to use altitude as a weapon, and to strike from above where the sun blinded their opponents. "You win before they know you're there," he told them. "If they see you first, you've already made a mistake." The Black Sheep learned quickly. Within 2 weeks of combat, they destroyed over 20 Japanese aircraft with minimal losses. The pattern repeated day after day, short, savage encounters that ended as quickly as they began. One of Boyington's most famous dogfights occurred on October 17, 1943. His flight of 8 Corsairs intercepted a formation of nearly 40 Japanese Zeros escorting bombers near Kahili. Outnumbered 5-1, Boyington led his squadron into the attack without hesitation. Diving from 15,000 feet, he opened fire on the lead element, his tracers slicing through the humid air. The first Zero exploded before the Japanese even began evasive maneuvers. The second broke formation, trailing smoke. Boyington rolled inverted, dropped behind another, and fired a short burst. Another kill. Within minutes, the sky dissolved into chaos. Corsairs and Zeros weaved through one another in a deadly ballet, engines roaring, machine guns stuttering. Boyington's voice came calmly over the radio. "Stay fast. Don't turn with them." His composure under pressure anchored the entire squadron. By the time the engagement ended, 9 enemy planes were downed, 3 credited to Boyington himself. When they landed back at Vella La Vella, his Corsair was streaked with oil and pitted with bullet holes. He climbed out, grinning, his white scarf stained with the sweat and smoke. His men idolized him, though they rarely said so. To them, he was more than a leader. He was proof that survival was possible in a world where the odds said otherwise. They called him a gambler, a drinker, a rogue, but in the cockpit, he was pure discipline. Pappy could spot an enemy at twice the range anyone else could, one pilot recalled. He'd roll into a dive before you even saw the flash of sunlight on a canopy. That instinct, the ability to sense motion, angle, and opportunity, made him deadly. By December, his personal score had reached 20 kills. Newspapers back home began calling him America's Marine Ace, though Boyington shrugged off the attention. "We were just trying to keep each other alive," he said later. The success of the Black Sheep Squadron came not only from Boyington's leadership, but from the psychological effect they had on the enemy. Japanese pilots had grown accustomed to American formations that broke easily under pressure. The Black Sheep did not break. They fought with aggression that unnerved even seasoned opponents. Their raids extended beyond dogfights. When not intercepting enemy aircraft, they attacked airfields, strafing runways, fuel depots, and parked bombers at treetop level. Boyington encouraged it. "Make them afraid to start their engines," he told his men. Low-level strafing became their trademark, fast, terrifying, and devastating. Corsairs swooped in so low their propellers cut through palm fronds, their tracers ripping through rows of aircraft before the enemy gunners could react. It was warfare stripped to its essence: speed, surprise, and destruction. One mission in November 1943 illustrated the sheer audacity of these attacks. Intelligence reported that the Japanese were massing aircraft at Kahili for a major counteroffensive. Boyington led 12 Corsairs on a preemptive strike. They flew below radar, hugging the waves until the coast rose before them. The airfield came into view, a patchwork of hangars, fuel drums, and camouflaged planes. Without hesitation, Boyington's Corsair roared over the tree line, guns blazing. The first passes ignited fuel stores, sending fire rolling across the runway. Pilots behind him picked off aircraft trying to take off. The air was thick with smoke and debris, the ground flashing with secondary explosions. In less than 10 minutes, the field was an inferno. Japanese observers later counted over 30 aircraft destroyed or damaged. The Black Sheep lost one plane. It was the kind of asymmetry that defined the Pacific War's final years. Precision and coordination overpowering courage and numbers. The intensity of those months took a toll. Constant missions, tropical diseases, and the strain of leadership wore on Boyington. He masked exhaustion with bravado, drinking heavily between flights and clashing with superiors over regulations. His squadron remained fiercely loyal, but command grew wary of his unpredictability. Despite the tension, results spoke louder than discipline. Between September 1943 and January 1944, the Black Sheep destroyed more than 97 confirmed enemy aircraft and damaged scores more. Their success came at a critical moment. By crippling Japanese air power in the Solomons, they paved the way for Allied advances toward Rabaul and Bougainville, opening the route to the Philippines. On January 3rd, 1944, Boyington led his final mission, a sweep over Rabaul, the most heavily defended Japanese stronghold in the Pacific. It was a mission he didn't have to fly. His superiors urged rest, but he insisted. "I can't ask my men to do what I won't do myself," he said. The formation encountered heavy resistance, dozens of Zeros climbing from the base. In the melee that followed, Boyington shot down at least one aircraft before being attacked from behind. His Corsair was hit repeatedly, fuel streaming from the wings. He bailed out over the ocean and was captured by a Japanese submarine hours later. For the next 20 months, he endured captivity in prison camps from Rabaul to Japan. Starved, beaten, and isolated, he refused to break. When the war ended and he returned home, his weight had dropped to less than 120 pounds. He learned only then that he had been awarded the Medal of Honor while still presumed dead. Boyington's survival and return made him a symbol of endurance as much as victory. In the post-war years, he spoke openly about his struggles, his flaws, and the men he had lost. "I wasn't the best pilot," he once said, "just the luckiest." But historians disagreed. His 28 confirmed kills made him the top-scoring Marine Corps ace of the war, and his leadership transformed a ragtag unit into a legend. The Black Sheep Squadron's exploits became the subject of books, documentaries, and even television dramatizations. Yet the reality behind the myth was simpler and more profound. Their success had less to do with swagger than with the quiet mechanics of preparation, disciplined teamwork, technological superiority, and relentless will. The tactics Boyington refined, low-altitude strafing, coordinated dives, hit-and-run assaults, became blueprints for future generations of fighter pilots. In Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, the lessons of the Black Sheep lived on. Their missions demonstrated that air superiority was not just about altitude or speed, but about initiative, the ability to dictate when and where the fight happened. Boyington understood that mastery came not from raw aggression, but from control. "You can't fight angry," he told young aviators years later. "You have to fight smart." Even decades after his death in 1988, Boyington's name evokes the paradox of the wartime ace, a man who thrived in chaos yet longed for peace. His dogfights over the Solomons were more than contests of skill. They were snapshots of a world in transition, where human instinct still mattered in an age increasingly defined by machines. Each time he dove toward an enemy formation, tracers flashing past his canopy, he was testing the limits of courage and technology alike. The Corsair's engine thundered like a living thing beneath him, and for those brief moments between life and death, Boyington embodied the essence of his generation, flawed, fearless, and utterly unstoppable. In the final tally, what made Boyington and his Black Sheep extraordinary was not merely their victories, but their defiance of expectation. They arrived as misfits, untested and unorthodox, and ended as one of the most effective squadrons in Marine Corps history. They proved that even in a war measured by mass production and strategy, individual skill and leadership could still alter the course of battles. Their low-altitude attacks crippled Japan's ability to project air power, and their dogfights shattered the myth of invincible zero pilots. Every strafing run, every burst of gunfire over the Pacific contributed to a greater revelation, that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. By the time the Black Sheep were disbanded in January 1944, the skies of the South Pacific belonged to the Allies. The islands that had once been stepping stones for Japanese expansion became graves for their ambitions. And at the center of that transformation stood a man who refused to follow the rules, but understood the meaning of the fight. Gregory "Pappy" Boyington did not win the war alone, but his example captured its essence. Courage without caution, precision without hesitation, humanity without illusion. His dogfights remain part of the story of how air superiority, and with it victory, was forged in the crucible of the Pacific sky. December 7th, 1941, just before 8 o'clock in the morning, the island of Oahu stirred awake beneath a sky as blue as polished glass. Palm trees stood motionless in the warmth, the harbor calm and reflective, ships resting at anchor after what promised to be an ordinary weekend. At the U.S. Army's Wheeler Field, 26-year-old Lieutenant George Welch was finishing breakfast when the first explosions rolled across the horizon. At first, no one moved. The deep, echoing thud of bombs seemed too distant, too unreal. Then came the unmistakable sound of aircraft engines, dozens of them, followed by the rising wail of air raid sirens. Welch ran outside, squinting into the sunlight, and saw columns of black smoke rising from Pearl Harbor, 15 miles away. In the next instant, a formation of Japanese dive bombers streaked overhead, their red circles glinting in the morning sun. The attack on Pearl Harbor had begun, and the world as he knew it was ending. George Schwartz Welch was not a man easily surprised. Born in Delaware in 1918, he had grown up fascinated by machinery, building model planes and taking apart engines before he was 10. By the time he entered the Army Air Corps in 1939, he had already logged more flight hours than most cadets twice his age. His instructors remembered him as calm, methodical, and analytical, the kind of pilot who treated flight not as thrill, but as precision. At Wheeler Field, Welch was stationed with the 47th Pursuit Squadron, alongside his friend and wingman, Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, another young officer from Oklahoma, known for his quick humor and fearlessness. Together, they represented the new generation of aviators, products of a modernized Air Corps that believed technology and training could make up for inexperience. None of that preparation, however, had accounted for the shock of that morning. The Japanese attack was meticulous in its planning. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of 183 aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor, targeting airfields first to cripple American response. Wheeler Field, home to dozens of P-40 Warhawks and P-36 Hawks, was one of the primary targets. Within minutes, the tarmac was a scene of devastation. Fighters lined up in neat rows for inspection, an anti-sabotage measure, became easy prey for strafing Zeros. Hangars erupted in flame. Mechanics and ground crews dove for cover as machine gun fire shredded everything in sight. Welch and Taylor raced toward their planes, only to find most of them burning. Their Warhawks had been moved the night before to Halewa Field, a small auxiliary strip on the north shore, miles away. It was an accident of geography that would give them their only chance to fight back. They sprinted for the nearest car, commandeered a Buick from a maintenance sergeant, and roared off down the narrow roads toward Halewa. The journey took them through chaos, columns of smoke rising from the coast, civilians staring skyward in disbelief, scattered Japanese planes flashing overhead. Welch drove while Taylor loaded ammunition belts into .50 caliber rounds from the back seat, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from adrenaline. "We didn't talk," Taylor later said. "We just drove." The road wound along cane fields and beaches, the radio crackling with frantic reports. When they arrived, Halewa Field looked deserted. 2 P-40s sat fueled and armed, glistening under the sun. Mechanics emerged from nearby huts, shouting that the field was under orders to stay grounded. Welch ignored them. "Get out of the way," he barked. Moments later, the Warhawks were roaring down the dirt runway, kicking up clouds of dust as they clawed into the sky. Neither man had altitude, formation, or warning radar. They climbed through open sky into a battlefield already in motion. Below them, Pearl Harbor burned, columns of smoke rising thousands of feet into the air, ships listing, oil fires spreading across the water. The first wave of Japanese aircraft was pulling out, but the second wave, consisting of dive bombers and torpedo planes, was just arriving. Welch and Taylor flew directly into them. They banked hard toward Ewa Field, where Japanese bombers were attacking marine installations. The air filled with tracers, smoke trails, and flashes of sunlight off wings. Welch spotted a formation of dive bombers and dived straight into them, his guns chattering. The first enemy plane burst into flames and spiraled into the sea. Taylor followed, downing another that exploded mid-air. It was chaos. targets everywhere, fuel running low, no coordination or guidance. They fought purely on instinct. Within minutes, the Japanese realized they were under counterattack. A group of Zero fighters peeled off to intercept the two lone Americans. Welch's Warhawk shuddered as bullets slammed into his fuselage, one round smashing his canopy glass. He pulled into a climb, rolled inverted, and came down on the tail of his pursuer. A short burst of gunfire sent the Zero plunging into the harbor. Taylor was hit next. Bullets ripped through his arm and leg, but he stayed in formation, refusing to break off. Together, they weaved through the chaos, firing at anything that moved. Their Warhawks were outmatched by the faster, lighter Japanese planes, but their advantage lay in dive speed. The P-40 could dive faster than a Zero without structural failure. Welch used it ruthlessly, diving, firing, climbing again. Each engagement lasted seconds, each kill a narrow escape from death. Their first sortie lasted barely 15 minutes. Running low on ammunition and fuel, they returned to Halewa to reload. Ground crews worked feverishly as explosions thundered in the distance. Within minutes, Welch and Taylor were airborne again, heading toward Barber's Point, where enemy planes were strafing airfields. They climbed through smoke, sunlight glinting off their wings. Over the coast, Welch spotted 9 bombers flying in formation at 4,000 feet. He climbed above them, rolled inverted, and fired a long burst. One bomber fell away in flames. Another began trailing smoke. Taylor attacked from below, setting a third ablaze before being forced to break off. In all, they shot down 6 enemy planes between them that morning. 2 confirmed by witnesses, 4 more probable. Against overwhelming odds, they had become the first American fighter pilots to take to the air during the attack on Pearl Harbor. When they landed after their second sortie, their Warhawks were riddled with holes. Welch's plane had taken a dozen hits. Taylor's hydraulic system was shot, his tires deflated. They climbed out, covered in sweat and smoke, their faces streaked with soot. For a moment, the enormity of what they had done didn't register. Around them, Wheeler Field burned. The air smelled of oil and cordite. Ambulances rushed between whole-smoking wrecks. Someone handed Welch a cigarette. He stood in silence, watching the black columns rising from the harbor. In a single morning, the Pacific Fleet had been crippled, and more than 2,400 Americans were dead. Yet in that same morning, 2 young men had proven that defiance was still possible, that even amid disaster, courage could find its wings. The counterattack by Welch and Taylor quickly became legend among those who survived the day. Their courage contrasted sharply with the helplessness that defined the rest of the morning. In an era before instant communication, rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed they had shot down a dozen planes, others said 20. Official reports eventually credited Welch with 4 confirmed kills and Taylor with 2. But numbers mattered less than symbolism. Their flight had been an act of instinct, not calculation. It gave shape to the first American resistance of the Pacific War, a defiant gesture against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. That act of defiance would ripple far beyond Hawaii. In the days that followed, Welch and Taylor were recommended for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork went as far as the War Department before being rejected. The reason was bureaucratic. Both men had taken off without direct orders, violating standing protocols that grounded aircraft during surprise attacks. Instead, they were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest American military decoration. Welch accepted it with his usual composure. Taylor, recovering from his wounds, joked that he'd rather have another plane. For both men, the recognition meant little compared to the reality of what lay ahead. The war had just begun, and the skies they had entered that morning would only grow more dangerous. Welch continued flying throughout the war, his reputation growing with each campaign. After Pearl Harbor, he was transferred to the 36th Fighter Squadron and later to the 81st Fighter Group, flying P-39 Airacobras and P-38 Lightnings in the Pacific. His talent for gunnery and instinctive tactics earned him respect from peers and commanders alike. He downed 16 enemy aircraft in combat, making him one of America's early aces. But those numbers, impressive as they were, never defined him. What set Welch apart was his composure, the same calm precision he had shown on that first morning of war. He treated aerial combat as an equation to be solved, a balance between speed, angle, and distance. "You can't fight with emotion," he told a journalist later. "You fight with calculation." The attack on Pearl Harbor had been a disaster, but in hindsight, it revealed the seeds of America's eventual dominance. The speed with which Welch and Taylor responded foreshadowed the industrial and organizational momentum that would later define the Allied war effort. Within 6 months, new P-40, P-38, and eventually P-51 Mustangs would flood the Pacific, flown by pilots trained under doctrines refined from the chaos of that morning. The courage of Welch and Taylor became part of that doctrine, not as myth, but as example. They had proven that initiative could overcome surprise, that courage could outpace command. In the structured machinery of modern warfare, their flight remained a reminder of the human element, the split-second decision to act when all logic said to stand still. Their story also underscored a broader truth about the early days of the Pacific War. America entered unprepared, underestimated, and scattered. Japan entered organized, disciplined, and ruthless. Yet from that imbalance emerged a pattern repeated throughout history: free individuals reacting faster than rigid hierarchies. Welch and Taylor did not wait for permission because instinct told them there would be no second chance. That instinct, the willingness to act independently within chaos, became one of America's most defining advantages as the war progressed. It was reflected in every pilot who dived through anti-aircraft fire over Rabaul, every bomber crew that pressed on through flak over Tokyo. The spirit of Pearl Harbor was not just the pain of loss, but the defiance born from it. In 1944, Welch returned to the United States as a test pilot for North American aviation. There, his mastery of flight found new purpose. He flew the prototype P-51 Mustang at speeds that shattered previous records, testing the limits of what piston engines could achieve. Later, he became one of the first men to pilot the experimental P-86 Sabre, a jet fighter designed to usher in a new era of aviation. On October 1st, 1947, 6 days before Chuck Yeager's officially recorded supersonic flight, Welch is believed to have broken the sound barrier during a steep dive, though the achievement was never formally recognized due to security restrictions. It was a fitting footnote to a man whose life had been defined by speed, courage, and understated brilliance. Tragically, his career ended as it began, in the cockpit. On October 12, 1954, while testing an F-100 Super Sabre near the Mojave Desert, Welch's aircraft suffered structural failure during a high-speed dive. He ejected too late. He was 36 years old. The Air Force buried him with full honors, his coffin draped in the same flag that had flown over the ruins of Pearl Harbor 13 years earlier. Those who knew him remembered him not as a man of speeches or medals, but as one who acted without hesitation when the world stopped moving. The legacy of George Welch's counterattack endures not only in history books, but in the quiet understanding among pilots who follow him. Every takeoff under pressure, every decision made in seconds, carries an echo of that morning. The scramble down dirt roads, the engines roaring to life, the sky filled with fire. It was not just the first counterstrike of the Pacific War. It was a statement that even in moments of chaos, skill and will could prevail. The P-40 Warhawk, heavy and underpowered compared to its enemies, became a symbol of that spirit, resilient, blunt, and unstoppable once airborne. In Welch's hands, it became something more. A testament to what courage looks like when it takes shape in metal and motion. When historians speak of the impossible moments of World War II, those instances when individuals defied the scale of the conflict, Welch's name belongs among them. He did not plan a mission, assemble a squadron, or receive intelligence briefings. He reacted to the sight of his world burning and chose to rise into it. His fight that morning did not change the outcome of the attack, but it changed the tone of history's telling. It showed that even amid catastrophe, resistance could begin with 2 men, 2 planes, and a single decision. The same spirit that later powered the industrial miracle of American air power, the same precision that would destroy enemy fleets and factories, was first expressed in that dust-choked runway on the north shore of Oahu. In the quiet aftermath of Pearl Harbor, as the fires finally died and the dead were counted, an officer reportedly found Welch sitting alone beside his damaged Warhawk, staring at the horizon. When asked what he had been thinking, he replied simply, that we weren't done yet. Those words, unrecorded in official reports but passed down through recollection, capture the essence of that day. The attack had been meant to break America's will. Instead, it revealed it. From the smoke of Pearl Harbor rose not only vengeance, but transformation. A nation learning, building, adapting faster than any enemy could imagine. And at its beginning stood 2 pilots who refused to watch from the ground. George Welch's story is not one of glory, but of reaction, an instinctive act of defiance in a moment when the world fell apart. It reminds us that even the greatest machines of war rely on human resolve. That history often turns not on grand strategy, but on the quiet certainty of a single decision. As his Warhawk climbed into the burning skies of Oahu, Welch could not have known that he was writing the first chapter of America's long road to victory. But in that moment, between the roar of engines and the rattle of gunfire, he became the embodiment of something larger than the war itself, the unbreakable conviction that no matter how sudden the blow, there is always someone willing to rise and fight back.